Hello, friends, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Wizard Factory podcast. We're joined with some very exciting guests this evening. This is Amanda Rachwitz and Larken Rose. I'm sure most of you have probably at least heard of them. If not, I would say, in my own words, that they are some of the more influential, philosophers and speakers and spreaders of truth within the ranks of the freedom and truth community, basically. And so tonight we're going to pretty much just have more of a casual conversation style, a little bit less structured than what we normally do. So, just start by saying welcome to the show, and we're so honored to have you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So Brian, did you have anything you want to throw in there first?
No, I figured, I guess, just really a good place we could maybe start at is, and this is something we talk about a lot here at the Wizard Factory, which is the power of mythology and story, and how that can not only have an effect on the subconscious mind, but, some of the other valuable things that we can get from that. And I know at one of your talks you did at Anarchy, Larken, that you actually used the allegory of the ring from Tolkien's work. So kind of we wanted to ask both of your individual thoughts on, what are some of the value, what are the things that you find useful about story and mythology that you can pull out, and how you can apply those to teach and spread a message of freedom and anarchy.
Well, it's interesting how many stories, and whether it's like modern movies or stories that are thousands of years old or anything in between, that people go rah, rah, rah for, that are about anti-authoritarians disobeying the big, powerful ruling class, and people cheer for the underdogs. And then in real life, they cheer for the ruling class.
Right. Like Star Wars comes to mind, the Rebel Alliance, and then that nasty Empire and everything. And it's like...
Right. And they just kind of don't notice the parallels. But the reason they don't notice the parallels is because they were raised in the mythology that says the ruling class that we bow to is the righteous, real, legitimate, proper one. And the fact that they don't notice the parallels between all the stories where the people they worship are the bad guys is just sort of sad. But it's very useful. I mean, I wrote The Iron Web, my first novel, to put it in story form, because I think that one of the reasons that's so powerful is if somebody's just sort of digesting a story and hearing an interesting tale of events that they think is about somebody else, they're not sort of on the spot, they're not challenged, they're not being argued with, but it can still make them think about, the principles behind it, and wow, what would I do, and who is the good guy here, and things like that. So I think fiction is a very useful way to convey actually good ideas.
I'll add on to that I actually think that while there's a lot of really good, it's really good story and mythology out there that expresses, at least on a philosophical level, true liberty and true anarchist thought, I still think there's a massive amount of room for it to continue to be done way better and even more in your face and even more bold than it has been, because now we're at a different place in the current times we're in, where there is this revolution of interest in philosophy. Like philosophy has been making a comeback, not just, amongst the ranks of people waking up to the ideals of true freedom and what that means, but just in universities. There are more and more people just going towards depth and meaning and logic and philosophy and studying this stuff. And so I think that, we can sort of carry the torch and the baton in our art and in our, maybe music and movie making and storytelling, and take it all the way to something a lot more bold. I even think, to bring in a reference that a bunch of people won't get, but I'll bring in Game of Thrones. For anybody listening who listens to this later who knows the Game of Thrones show or who read the books that it's based on, there's a lot of things that the characters say the author says certain things through the characters of Game of Thrones that are some of the most directly almost calling out authority for what it is that I've seen in a popular show in a very long time. Like some of the philosophical lines delivered by certain characters are very in your face, despite the fact that the whole world that thing is written about is saturated in the belief of the divine right of kings, and it's sort of demonstrating all the ugliness that comes from a world saturated in that belief. And yet the truth of how dangerous that is, and authority in general, and what authoritarian power is getting really clear in the way it comes out through the characters' voices and how they talk. And it really heartened me to see that a show like that was the most downloaded pirated show in the world, because I think there's a reason for that. I don't think it's because it's the Game of Thrones people actually like necessarily, while there are those people. I think it's the depth and meaning and what you have to follow, because it's not a pleasing show to watch. It's not a show where you want to identify with any of the characters. It's everything in that show sucks. Everything's dangerous. Everything's dark. Everything's nasty and depressing. And so it takes a certain kind of person to follow it. And then there's so many characters and so much going on that it's very complex. So there's certain kinds of brains that have to follow that show. And it's heartening to me that a lot of people really were into it and followed it, because it's a fictional world that Martin created that is very clearly just smashing the assumption that authority can be even remotely good in any form.
And it's a thing you've mentioned before is the fact that it's the answer to all the Disney garbage that glorifies royalty.
Yeah.
Like, oh, we have this great prince, he'll be a great ruler. And you see that in a bunch of tales, and it isn't just Disney, but it's all over the place. So we're up against a totally bogus mythology that the establishment is pushing out there that shows the ruler / savior / leader thing, which is never reality. And I love the fact that both Tolkien, I still like Tolkien a little bit better.
Well,
Hands down. Yeah.
I think that's unanimous here at the Wizard Factory.
But they both, I was actually very happy with the thing that almost nobody else was happy with in Game of Thrones. Like, don't you dare pretend that now we have the right savior, it's all going to turn out well. But so I was happy that it turned out horribly. Like, okay, that's what really happens.
Yep.
And it's the same thing with Tolkien. And I love the fact that, spoiler for anyone who doesn't know Lord of the Rings, if there is anybody, Frodo failed. Even Frodo failed because he had the ring too long. He succeeded by accident, but he failed. His spirit failed. And it's so important to show that. And we are up against the mythology that the control freaks are pushing that says, no, you get the right person. You need a courageous blah, blah, blah. So it is just it's a battle of the stories. And so many people unknowingly and unwittingly get their belief systems by way of the stories they hear, the movies and the anything else on a subconscious level that they don't even think about it. To them, it's not even really a philosophy. It's just sort of this residual stuff that's stuck in their brain that they've never really examined, but it's stuck there from all the things they've been exposed to. And we just need to expose them to more freedom and less bootlicking garbage.
That you guys definitely hit on a lot of good things.
Oh yeah.
When you're talking about the value of mythology and story to be able to where it doesn't feel like you're coming at them directly. So you're being able to bypass the ego and then actually get down to the subconscious and the unconscious mind, which are a lot more powerful than the actual conscious mind. This is where all the programming is actually kept. So, and I think it's really excellent that you guys brought up the point of, not only the power of mythology for, learning proper lessons, but how that same power can also be used to control the mind and is used. So, there's kind of this battle of the different mythologies out there and, what programming is getting put in. So I think that's very interesting to highlight and look at.
Yeah. An interesting trick that occurred to me after I did it, like I'd like to claim credit for it and say it was on purpose. But I wrote The Iron Wed, which is a novel, and the characters, have their parts and things they say, and there's a big speech at the end, and I won't say by who, or in case anybody hasn't read it yet. But it occurs to me that when somebody is watching a movie or reading a book, if somebody's, they're pontificating their opinions or something, the viewer doesn't need to feel threatened. And yet, it's easier to threaten. Like, it's easier to threaten their viewpoint. It's funny because I think it was 2 days ago, I was at a supermarket and a random person I didn't know recognized me. It was like the 9th, might be the 10th time that's ever happened to me. But he brought up the speech, which was made into a video called Message to the Voting Cattle.
Yep.
And I told him I was scared of that being posted on YouTube because it just starts out rude and in your face and gets worse from there. And it's not lead in, you don't get the context. I was like, that's just going to scare away everybody. And there's been a hugely positive response to it. And this guy, the guy I met, he thought it was really cool. And I thought, I thought it would scare away almost everybody. And I let the guys do it because I was like, okay, you did a great job. So we'll see what happens. But it occurred to me after the fact that if it's a fictional character taking them to task, like, it doesn't do them any good to, like, make excuses or argue. Like, it's a fictional person, he can't hear you. As opposed to, like, one of us is trying to tell them what we think. So it's funny that I accidentally learned that if a fictional character chastises them for being cowards, it hits them harder. And there were people who commented under that video, they said, this embarrassed me, this shamed me, this is about me, and I felt it, I felt bad, and I was like,
that's awesome.
that it did that, and second of all, that they dared to comment that under YouTube and say, I felt really bad because it was totally accurate and it was totally about me. And a number of people have done that. And it only later occurred to me, I bet it helped a whole lot that it was a fictional character, calling them out on their authoritarian BS.
Yep.
And that's cool. So that was a good accidental trick.
Yeah, Brian, what you said I thought was interesting about, sort of bypassing the programming and the left brain, ego brain or whatever, to tie it back with an actual allegory about the allegory. I always think of Cerberus, the three-headed dog from, Harry Potter, and I'm sure other mythology too, but I know it from that. And they have to, like, put it to sleep with music, and then they sort of tiptoe past it to sneak in that trap door. That's pretty much what you got, what we're getting at here with the allegory, and I think what you guys kind of aim for with the whole Candles in the Dark program and things like that is just sort of bypassing that angry dog that's been taught to be really mean and everything, and sort of slipping past and really appealing to the human being inside them that's all kind of, timid and lying dormant within. But like you said, Larken, when it's a fictional character, it's easier for them to relate because it's not a real person that's directly speaking to them. And then, like you said, it's the irony of how, everybody's cheering for freedom in the movies, but then we're cheering for slavery in real life, mainly because they think that, we don't have an evil empire here. They all care about us. They have our best interests at heart and everything like that. But I think a lot of the appeal of these kind of movies, though, is that their brain may be tricked into thinking that, but their heart knows better. And in a way, they can kind of, it's like living vicariously through those characters in the movie, because deep down they know the truth, and they wish that they could be the heroes in those movies. And they know that they're shut down cowards that would never take on that role if it was presented to them in reality.
Yeah.
So a lot of,
And I think it's a really good sign that those movies are so popular. And like, there's V for Vendetta, obviously. There's
Matrix.
And The Matrix and Hunger Games.
Hunger
I knew
Games.
somebody who had read the books, and they told me the end, and I was like, I wonder if they dare to all the way do the end the way it really is.
And then they did.
and they dared to, and I won't say what it was. But I think it's because it's very heartening that people go rah, rah, rah. It's sort of annoying that they don't figure out how that applies right here and now. But it shows that people aren't, like, they still have the spirit of freedom in them. They've just been trained really hard to ignore it in this day and age right here and now, but inside them they still have the thing that wants that to win. Like, imagine if we were in a society where everybody was cheering for the bad guys in all those movies, it'd be like, well, I give up, I'm gonna run and hide in the woods for the rest of my life. But there is still the spirit in people, which is why people like those movies, Braveheart and The Patriot, and there's a long list.
Right.
And
I remember one of my favorite movies when I was young is, and I wasn't even really technically supposed to see this, but, like my parents made an exception. They got me in the movie, which was Braveheart. So I actually watched that movie when it was still in theaters. That was a pretty good while ago, and I was a wee lad, if you know what I mean. And even way before I ever, kind of started deprogramming, there was something about that movie that spoke so deeply to me. I so resonated with the sense of honor that the men had, their fierceness to like really give everything for what they knew to be right, and everything like that. Yeah, that's another really good one, even though it's horribly historically inaccurate, but it's a good story for sure, with a lot of good, good message to it.
Right. And I got to say, I'll admit that Mel Gibson, I think, as far as I remember, was the first time a movie got me to cry at a guy dying, like a baby or a woman, but like a big grown guy, and but the power of the where he's being disemboweled and fun stuff, and the audience is watching, and there's a little kid up on their parents' shoulders. I was like, oh, it's so horrible. The powerful depiction of so much human history has been this, and it dared to show how freaking horrible it is. It wasn't everybody cheering for the good guy, because most of history hasn't been that. It's been idiots going along with the establishment. And I think one of the things that made it so powerful was not just depicting the people fighting for freedom. It was depicting people that the average American should actually relate to, which is the audience going, yeah, get him, he's an enemy of the state. And then near the end, they're like, oh, okay, this isn't fun to watch anymore. Why is he really the bad guy? So that was, I think it was more powerful because they depicted the stupid sheep mentality and the cowardice of the general public, which is the only reason why there was a ruling class. It's the only reason there's ever a ruling class.
Right. And this is interesting. This kind of popped into my head not that long ago. So I'm just, bringing it up here because we're, on the subject of the movie Braveheart. But when he's going through all that trial at the end, and again, like when you spoke about Lord of the Rings, you guys have both talked a lot about narcissist and the unmistakable parallels between the way the state operates and, as a side note, the way Yahweh kind of behaves a little bit, and how your friendly neighborhood narcissist and those little telltale signs and everything. So I was just kind of pondering about the gaslighting that was going on when that cardinal guy was trying to get him to kiss the ring and confess his sins, because that's exactly they have that God complex where they want you to kneel and admit that you were wrong for simply wanting sovereignty.
Right. The sanction of the victim is what Ayn Rand called it. They want you to feel bad about having disobeyed them instead of going, yeah, you can hurt me, but I had no obligation to do what you said.
Right. In fact, in an episode, just a few episodes back, I think it was our Thin Blue Lie episode about police psychology, I brought up the point from your guilt-free anarchy or guilt-free freedom speech about it's normal to feel a little rattled because you are under coercion, but don't you dare feel actually guilty for a victimless crime simply because it's against the law. That really resonated with me. Yeah.
And just the fear is not enough to keep an empire alive. If most of their victims don't feel a moral obligation to bow, then any control they have is very temporary and very weak, because people make you'll obey you as long as you're right in front of me with a gun pointed at me.
Wow.
The moment you're not, bye.
That's a really valid point. And I think it leads to a great question that we actually wanted to ask both of you, which is your stance on like cosmic law or objective morality in regards to human behavior, things like that. Would you both like to riff on that a little bit?
You want to go first since I've been?
Yeah. I guess about that, what would be like, is there just a direct question you want to ask about what I think about objective morality? Like, or is your question, like, should I start with answering whether I think there's an objective morality? Is that something that you're aiming towards?
Yeah. Sure. However you'd like to answer.
Oh, okay. I wasn't, because I was like, that's like a massive topic. That's like, saying, let's talk about the nature of the universe. Well, we could go on for a while.
We like to big questions so we can start.
You broke up there a little bit, but
what did Brian say just now?
Oh, I said we like to ask the bigger questions, so we can really start to delve into it and leave, leave lots of room to get good stuff out.
I think for me, there's the irrefutability of existence. Like, in order to talk about what I am and who I am, I have to have a thought to begin with. I have to say it. So I think, therefore I am. I would start with that. And then, because there is whatever is, there's that, and then there's my perception of whatever is. So the longer I live, the more it seems that I can uncover actually objective truths about the universe, which means that it's very possible there has to be, it's very possible there's an objective moral structure. And then my job, I see it as, it's my job to figure out how much of an objective moral structure there is, and what that branch is, like, what is that mechanism in the universe, and what does it include, and how much actual freedom and liberty do I have within that moral framework to do certain things, to do good or whatever, and without branching into doing something that's actually unhealthy or actually wrong, because there's so much of this gray, and people don't like gray. A lot of people really want, I think a lot of the reason people like the state and they like religion, which is, religiosity to me, like, is the same as legalism. It's the obsession with ritualistic behavior that makes you feel like you have the answers to how to be a good person. And you follow ritualistic behavior over and over again, that if I do these things, then I am a good person. And if I don't do these things, I'm a bad person, kind of a thing. And I think that people don't like to look at the gray. I think there's a whole lot of gray. That's what freedom is. Your job is to figure out what your own path is. But I really believe there's a base moral structure that I've been able to observe. One is that consent exists. Where we draw our line in the sand, that might vary. Like, I might be offended by somebody walking up and grabbing my face and kissing me who doesn't know me. In other countries, that might be an awesome greeting, and it's totally welcome and fine. I would be like, get off me, dude. I feel violated. What the fuck are you doing? And so that's an example of lines in the sand being drawn differently. But the
consent itself is what's consistent.
Oh, what?
I said the consent itself is what is consistent. That's that's the baseline. Wherever you draw the line, it's for you to decide, because you own you, and you get to say.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing, is people try to say that it's all subjective. Like, well, it's just, some people can think murder is fine, and it's like, well, that doesn't make murder okay. Just because somebody thinks it's okay to murder doesn't mean they're excused from people defending themselves against murder, and everybody defends themselves against an attacker when they feel attacked. So if every single human being, without fail, has a point at which they feel something called violated, or they experience something called trauma because somebody else crossed a line for them, and without fail every human being has that ability to be violated, that means we must have something called consent or free will. Something can be violated. Everybody can be, because the minute we're breathing, you can then try to kill us, and we try to not die, which means we're trying to stay here. We're trying to stay alive. We're trying to have and do and be. So we are trying to exist. And the fact that every human being is trying to stay alive the minute they are born means that there's an objective ought there that the universe is demonstrating. I don't have to put it in words. The universe and you know, evolutionary biology or creation is trying to form this free thing that wants to be and do and think and exist. And if you try to make it not, it will be traumatized and it will defend itself and it will fight back and it will try to get you off of it because you're violating that free will. And to me, that's irrefutable. So anybody can argue about, you know, ethics and preferences, as in, like, you know, different ways that we have cultural boundaries and what we think is okay and our, you know, marital and sexual life, and what we think is okay and how we raise our kids and what we think is okay and how we do business with one another. And that can all vary culturally, and they can have, you can have a bunch of different variables, and that is what people get hung up on, and they call that subjective morality.
Well,
and
then they throw out the baby with the bathwater. They're like, well, I don't have a clear answer on every little thing, therefore rape and murder is just subjective, you know.
Right.
Like,
and the thing is, to me, what is objective is what response do you get when you have a certain cause. When you have a cause, what effect do you get in the universe? And if every single time a human being tries to violate the free will or liberty of another human being, if every human being in the universe has a point at which they cry out and defend themselves and fight back, that means every human being has something they want to protect, and that is their existence, their free will, their sense of self, their boundaries, whatever that is. And so that to me is obvious, that you can't get around that because it's as real as we're breathing. The fact that that's objective doesn't mean there isn't other, there aren't a lot of other things that are subjective. And so that took a lot of thought for me to get to, because for a long time I was really, really wrestling with, you know, what is morality? What is subjective? Is it subjective? Is it objective? And so I don't think that the fact that there's an objective morality means any one of us gets to say we fully understand the objective morality and what everyone needs to do within it. It is actually all of our each individual human on the earth, it's all of our jobs to figure out for ourselves what morality is and what is objective, what we believe is objective and what isn't. And we need to be honest, and we need to use the tools of, you know, logic and grammar to figure that out for ourselves. It's, the answer is not, well, once I think I have it figured out, go and police everybody else. And that's another thing, is people get scared of objective morality because they think if you say anything like, I think I might have discovered some objective truth here, they think that you're immediately going to jump to, now I'm going to enforce it on everyone. So they're triggered by you saying that, because what they hear is, you know, they hear a Christian saying, I know for sure this is how you should live, and I'm going to go on the crusades now. You know what I mean? That's what they hear.
Very valid. Yeah.
Excellent actor.
I forget how many years ago, but I came up with the term, because I couldn't think of a better term for it, universal intention, which to me, there's a lot of stuff that, to me, there is evidence everywhere that the universe wants certain things to be the way they are. And I don't believe in what most people call God, and I don't think there's a guy in the sky with switches and levers. I don't think it works that way at all. But there are very much huge signs in nature, but also in humanity, that we are supposed to be a certain way, and almost all of us, other than maybe the sociopaths, we know it. If we see somebody like chopping up little kids, all of us has an internal thing that says, not that, we're not supposed to be that, not good, that's not what we're supposed to be.
Not that.
Not that.
And the thing is, if there isn't objective morality, there isn't morality at all. Like, I compare it to, like, somebody saying, well, I wrote this paper on the animal that's called the sklonky gonk. It's like, well, what's that? Well, it doesn't really exist, but here are my opinions about it.
Right.
Like,
well, if it's if it's subjective, it's just an opinion. So it's basically like saying, I think ice cream is delicious, therefore ice cream is delicious. Let it be stated into the universe. I mean, it doesn't work that way. But where I think a lot of people get really hung up is, first of all, consent is subjective to the subject, because it's for each individual to decide, and it is based on their feelings. That I'm not refuting at all, but it is also objective to anyone else who is not the subject. I don't get to decide oh, you don't really feel like, you're not really telling me no, you don't want to be assaulted or whatever. Like, that's just your opinion. It doesn't count. You know, like, mine's just as good as yours.
Yeah.
But it's amazing how many people try to argue for that. And yet, you know, it's amazing how much they argue for that, but yet they themselves, if you ask them personally, well, do you think that it's okay to rape and murder? Well, no, I don't, but other people, you know, might think otherwise. And I'm like, yeah, and they're wrong. And the fact that you have that opinion, you know, like, if you think that's just an opinion, then you have to concede that other people who think those things are fine, their opinion is just as valid as yours, because it's all just subjective, and it's all just people's whims and preferences. No big deal.
And
Well, by definition, the people that are being violated by the people doing the aggressing, the raping, the murdering, never want that.
Right. That's why it's up to the victim, not the abuser.
They didn't
The victim
want it.
gets to decide.
Right. There's never been a situation where it's been like, well, we have this culture where every month or so, we all like murder our like children, like, or whatever, that are left over, and you know, the middle children are always cool with it. They're like, whatever, murder us, it's cool.
You're just describing anarchy.
Like, it's not like, well, you know, there's this neighbor down the street, and like, he's raped me several times, but it's okay because I like rape, which that doesn't make sense, because then it's not
That's
actually
just
rape.
called rough
So
sex.
like, well, wait a minute.
Yeah.
So it can't be, there can never be a situation where a whole culture thinks aggression's okay, because by definition, aggression has somebody involved that doesn't think that's okay.
Right. You
So
can't
every
consent
time
to having your you can't consent to having your consent violated.
Yeah.
Right.
So
It's
by definition,
impossible.
when somebody has been violated, then it's wrong.
Right.
They don't like it. No
Mhm.
human wants to be violated. That's why I tell people, it doesn't matter if a tyrant thinks he can rule the whole world. He's still bound by that objective morality that consent exists and consent should not be violated, because he doesn't want
to be ruled.
violated.
Right.
He doesn't want to be
He
ruled.
just thinks I should get to violate
Right.
it and everyone else.
Right.
And nobody should have to ever like defend themselves yet.
But that is why they need the mythology of authority to teach people that in this case, it's actually noble for you to be subjugated and controlled and aggressed against.
Mhm.
And you're like, it's virtuous for you to let that happen. If I'm the aggressor, the lawmaker, the king, the whatever,
The good guy.
because in any other context, it would just be immediately insane. The one thing is I rarely talk about my view of like the origin of morality and what it is and where it comes from, just because to me it doesn't matter, because the vast majority of people understand you shouldn't attack people and I don't want to be attacked. And the reason they think that is kind of irrelevant to me. Like, I will use, and like in Candles in the Dark, we don't say, well, what's the, like, is there a religious basis? Is there a book? Is there do you think it's okay to attack people? No. Okay, cool. We'll move from there. I don't care why you think that. And luckily, the vast majority of people already think that. So I don't usually in public bother discussing something that, to me, I don't care if somebody thinks, well, this book told me not to attack people. It's like, okay, I don't really think that's why you shouldn't attack people, but all right, whatever your reason for not attacking people, let's go with that.
Right.
It is a fun discussion to have with people who like to think about stuff. But for most people, I just bypass it, because as long as you have some reason to think that you shouldn't be attacked and you shouldn't attack others, we're good. Like, I don't care what.
Well, the irony is, you know, to have that, you know, innate, you know, sense that we all, you know to be called conscience, etymologically breaks down to con, meaning together or with, and sciere, or science itself, is knowing. It's not with, you know, believing or with you know, like it's a knowing, and knowing implies what you an objective truth of some kind. And people who don't have a conscience, somebody who don't have a knowing, they simply don't know. Doesn't make that knowledge not there. It's just that they don't have it.
Yeah, it's literally like someone being born blind. Like, Well, you, for some reason, don't have the sense that perceives that thing.
I actually heard an interesting story about, there was a guy who it's funny because it was not from an anarchist perspective, from unnecessarily. It was a guy who became a Christian, and he became a Christian much later in his life, and he was, the kind of Christian that was actually very passionate about who Christ is, that kind of Christian, I think the way Christians ought to be. And, Christ is somebody who preached love and nonviolence, love your neighbor. And this guy ended up much later on, he ended up a pastor. By the time he ended up a pastor, he was telling people stories about how he got to where he was, and how for the first, I think most of his young years or something, for the first whole first half of his life, maybe his whole childhood, he said that he did awful things to people, because in his own memory, he's like, I genuinely did not have empathy. Like, I did not even connect with the pain that I was causing other humans. It wasn't even malice. He said, he told a story about how one night in his bed as a young kid, and this is frightening to think about, but he's like, I just had a curious thought, and it wasn't an angry thought, and it wasn't a hateful thought. It was just like, I wonder what my dad's head would look like if I hit it really hard with a bat. And so he decided to try. Got up and went and got a bat and smashed his dad's head with it. Because what will happen if I do this? Sociopathy, right there. And it took, I forget what the turning point was for him, but he basically describes an experience of having an experience of what God is to him, and the source of love in the universe that he experienced. But it came from other people doing things to him that made him feel pain and made him start to connect with the pain that he was causing other people. And it was like his empathy had to be awakened. And it was this incredibly powerful, transformative experience for him, that the way he went, that turned him into a Christian. Like, that's where he went, because for him, his experience was, he felt like he experienced that Christ consciousness of love through several hard experiences that taught him how to feel others' pain. But that connection, he's like, that connection just wasn't there. It was like he was alone, and other humans they were like other animals. They were just things. And he described how he really did, just like his brain just seemed to see other people as things, like to mess with. And that's just, that sort of thing both unnerves me and fascinates me, because it tells me that there is all the way both ends of the spectrum. You can sort of be disconnected from whatever this knowing is, or this truth is, that's there in the universe to find, and then you can find it. Right.
Logically or empathically. That's what's interesting. And what's interesting is empathy is a form of logic, because it's simply being logically consistent. I don't like this. They probably don't like that. It's actually very logical.
Right. And
that brought up go ahead.
No, go ahead. I've been babbling.
What that brought up for me was a very interesting point, and it's that how sometimes experiencing suffering ourselves will actually allow us to grow empathy for others. And it reminded me of a practice I used to do when at one point I was an order follower. I joined like the Marine Corps right out, like when I was 17, and I was a total, cult member, very gung-ho and young and stupid. And after I got out, I was trying to, start connecting with my emotions, because I had been so disconnected that anytime I saw anyone experiencing emotions, it would actually enrage me. I would actually want to then violate, harm them, because I saw them feeling. So one of the practices I started doing was just putting myself in the shoes of someone who was suffering, imagining myself and kind of visually putting myself there as an exercise, in order to actually stimulate those extremely intense feelings, because I needed that kind of stimulation in order to actually crack myself open, so I could start this path to the discovery of truth and, figuring out, these things, because, I had been so programmed through my early childhood and growing up that, it took some kind of major things like that and practices to actually start unprogramming myself through being able to awaken some of that empathy. So I think that's an interesting thing to look at, and that we can take into account here.
Yeah, and I think we all, another term I made up because I hadn't heard one that worked for me before, is direct access. Like, we all in our conscience have direct access to at least generally what's right and wrong if we bother to look, if we bother to tap into it. Because again, you can't, if you all the way have no access to something, you can't know anything about it. Like, if all you have is, this guy told me something about some animal species on the other side of the world, you don't know anything. You're taking on faith what he said. He might be wrong. You don't know it. If it's secondhand, you're just guessing. And if we don't have direct access to morality, and you're like reading a book or something that says, well, this book says it's the word of God and this is the truth, how would you know the difference if your own brain can't tell the difference between right and wrong? If it says you should go kill all the redheads, oh, well, it says kill all the redheads. So who am I to question it?
That's why blind faith is such a glorified virtue in a lot of our culture.
Yeah.
That blind faith is, oh, well, this is an authority figure saying this, so rather than me having self-gnosis about it and actually not just knowledge but understanding, you just blindly believe it because authority.
Yeah. Now I gotta throw in a thing, because I don't belong to the religion I was raised in. It's a little sect of Christianity. It's based on the writings of Emanuel Swedenborg, but I cannot for a moment pretend that it didn't have a big impact on me, that I was raised in a religion based on the writings of somebody who said faith alone is about as bad as it gets. He talked about there being an internal sense to the Bible, and the great red dragon, like the ultimate evil, that was faith alone, believing something somebody told you. And to have a religion teach you that you have to understand it for yourself or it's worthless, that's pretty dang unusual. And I think, even though I'm not part of that religion anymore, I think that was definitely, helped give me a head start to be able to question things, because in his own writings, he said, you shouldn't take my word for it either. If it doesn't make sense to you, if it doesn't resonate with your understanding and conscience, why would you believe it? You shouldn't. And so starting with that mentality instead of what most religions do, which is like, if you don't believe this book, you're going to burn in hell. And it's just a threat. It has nothing to do with understanding or compassion or conscience. It's just, you better believe this or we're going to light you on fire for all eternity. Like, okay, I guess I better believe it.
So it's funny that you mentioned that, because different than you. I mean, I grew up in more non-denominational. It wasn't like Presbyterian, Lutheran, anything like that, but non-denominational, secular-ish Western Christianity. Like, it's hard to say what that really is, but it's more like watered down Christianity, in more, the in the church, like the worship group is that brings in music for the church isn't a choir. They worship God by having a rock band that just has soft Christian rock or whatever. It's that kind of thing, more based in kind of the Jesus freak hippie movement that came from like the 70s. And I grew up in churches that were way more relaxed. They weren't like super religious about, I mean, the pastor probably smoked plenty of weed and drank a lot of beer. But it was one of those things where I grew up, reading and paying attention to a bunch of the stuff Jesus said in the Bible, and there was a lot of focus on Christ himself, less focus on the barbarism of the Old Testament, more focus on love and acceptance and grace. And what's funny to me is that a lot of Christians don't see the parallels between what modern day, liberty-minded people are trying to tell them and trying to say, and what their own Christ was saying, because a whole lot of that philosophy is actually in the Bible. And if you want to talk about cherry-picking the Bible, there were a group of Christians called the Bereans. There were just a group of people called the Bereans, and they were basically very intellectual, and they were like, we're looking at this scripture, we're looking at these scriptures we have, and we're studying them, and we're not just taking them as, we're not just swallowing them and reading them and assuming we know what they all mean for immediately. We're trying to really understand, challenge ourselves to understand, and figure out how we can have a reasonable, logical discussion about our faith here. And they were like absolutely like applauded for that. Like that was something that was like, you should be able to give an intellectual, reasonable answer for what you believe. That was something that was understood, that was a good thing. And then the whole point that I think was missed in when I grew up was that the whole weird contradiction of, well, we need the institutions and the pastors to tell us how to interpret the Bible, except the point of Christ coming philosophically, what he was trying to say to the world was every person comes to God through the heart. That's the only way they come to God. The Bible also said, like, man looks on the outside, but only God sees the heart. And I think of it as, like, whatever the intention is behind the universe that's creating all of this, that's moving through us. So our access to truth, it has to be inward. It has to be. Because that's the whole thing that Christ came to end, was the priesthood. And then Christians immediately turned around and created the church institution. So now we're back to everybody goes to church and sits in front of one guy. He tells us how to interpret the Bible. And we don't have to challenge ourselves to see if we're actually wrong. We just swallow whatever the interpretation was we were told when we were 5. We keep repeating it. And then it turns into this. And, you know, it turns into bogus crap, because then you get the influence of everybody else's beliefs, and then you get the top down thing of, well, all we need is for this one pastor to repeat some bullshit, and we have a whole congregation that goes and teaches all their families the same bullshit and for years.
There's always control freaks trying to hijack any idea and make it into a source of power. My brother found a really old book written by some important guy in the church I grew up in. I forget how many decades ago. I think it was actually titled Authority in the Church, and he was this big authoritarian, and like, we have to mimic the Catholic Church, and we need everyone to believe like the ministers when they tell what the truth is. But the hysterical thing that my brother and I still make fun of is he was like, and they have to accept every word of Swedenborg's writings as the gospel truth, and they can't question it. I was like, yeah, but one of the things he said is you can question it. Like Swedenborg said, you're supposed to question this. Okay, so we have to accept on blind faith that we're supposed to question it. And like, how does that work? But even something like that, somebody comes along and tries to make it an authoritarian mechanism for control, even when they did it with Jesus, and they do it all over the place.
Yep. The Roman state did it because the Roman state was like, oh, this guy's preaching nonviolence. And the Roman state is kind of based on
do violence to him.
This is a problem. Well, magically, suddenly the Roman state we'll call ourselves Christians. And then we'll force people to join us.
Right.
It'll be great.
Later we can have crusades where we march around the world saying, you're going to believe in this gentle pacifist or we'll kill you.
Well, I think one of the common themes we can look at here is no one has the monopoly on truth. So this idea that truth can only come from the Bible, you know, I completely reject that idea, because it has to be a direct line of communication between you and your experience, because that's why we manifested into this physical form, to grow as an individual, to move through the experiences of life, and to come into further alignment with truth. And that's why natural law is so important, and that's why we put such a heavy emphasis on that, because that's the real Bible. It's built into the universe, and everyone can interact with it. It's like an interactive video game, and it's teaching you lessons. It's not just read this book, and if it doesn't come from this book, and then that's the other thing. It's like, well, if Jesus is teaching truth, well, what if you just discovered that truth, but you didn't read the Bible? You just came to it because, your own consciousness arrived there. But but Christians are so dogmatic that if it doesn't come from Christ, then you're not saved or whatever.
But it's pretty easy. Logically, it doesn't make any sense. So it's pretty easy to make their heads explode, where they go, this is the infallible word of God. It's like, how do you know? Like, you literally have to be infallible to be able to say that something else is infallible. And if you say, well, the book said so, well, if it's wrong, then it's wrong, and it wasn't right to say it was infallible. And I can give you
which version?
Something different. And says
which version? And which interpretation
you would get is that they personally used their own brain to decide it was infallible, which means their brain is still on top.
They're putting their brain in the place of, I know what is infallible to begin with. Right. I know that how to identify this is infallible. I know what the entirety of God looks like in book form. I know him so well. I know the ins and outs of him that I can perfectly tell you that I know this book is him and infallible, which is the most arrogant thing you can say, because you have to literally claim to be God or have God level knowledge to know.
No, what they did is they made God use the mirror, and then it mapped his brain, and then they put it into a book, right?
Yeah, it worked perfectly. And but they do this weird thing, and it's all about trying to escape responsibility, because it's like, well, I'm going to decide this is infallible. I don't have to think anymore. I now have the whole thing. It's like, how do you know it's the whole thing? Shut up! Like, I just know. I magically know.
My pastor told me.
Now I'm going to subjugate my own conscience and my own brain to this thing. Just pointing out that, yeah, but you chose to do that.
It's anti-sovereignty. That's what it is. And that's what it's for. It's not just by accident. No. It is anti-sovereignty mind control programming.
Absolutely.
Yes,
and it's what government is for. It's what a lot of religions have been for, is to try to get the person to say, well, I'm not fit to judge. Ayn Rand, that's one of the things she got right. Who am I to judge and figure out right and wrong? I'm just me. I have to defer to who? You're going to decide who to defer to anyway. It's still on you. There is no way to escape this. But people try so hard because they don't want the responsibility of admitting, wow, I kind of have to figure out the whole world and have to figure out how I'm supposed to behave, and there's no shortcut.
Well, it's interesting. You can look at any possible statement of solipsism, which, for the viewing, audience or anyone who doesn't know what that word means, it's basically that truth can't be objective. It's all about just simply your perception and what you can, know to be true for you. It's this whole my truth and your truth, and we all have different truths, and la la la. We live in our own little bubbles, this kind of thing. The second they open their mouth in disagreement with your assertion of objective truth, they're asserting that they have the objective truth that conflicts with yours, and theirs is the right one.
Right.
So no matter what they say, they've defeated their own argument as soon as they open their mouth to disagree with anything.
Yeah. Right. To quote this brilliant friend of mine on Facebook, I don't know his name. I can't remember. He said, condemnation of a moral judgment is a moral judgment.
That sounds so familiar.
Oh, wait. It was you.
Yeah. You extremist. But
that's one of my favorite things to point out, though, is like, this morality is relative and there's no absolutes. Is that absolutely true?
That's such an absolute statement you're making about no absolutes. Yeah, exactly.
And the funny thing is, like, when people ask me, like, well, what do you think of moral nihilism? I think the vast majority of people who call themselves that aren't. They just think it sounds cool. And every once in a while, somebody will come on and say, morality is, there's no such thing, it's all just blah, 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 blah. There's no such thing, a total nihilist. And I said, so should people agree with what you just said? Yeah. That's a should. You already blew it. Well, no, they shouldn't. Well, then what are you doing here? Shut up and go away.
Like if you're a nihilist, you should never actually argue for anything.
If you're zealously trying to talk somebody into it and then claiming that everything is relative and there's no such thing as truth, you're already just a schizo who doesn't even know what he believes.
By claiming nihilism, your declaration is implying that your statement has meaning, which is automatically making you not a nihilist because you're applying meaning to something.
Right. So that's why I say, nihilism is the unicorn. There's only people who think they're nihilists. There is no such thing as a nihilist.
Absolutely.
So I tell people all the time, well, what do you think of nihilism? I say, there's no such thing. There's no such thing as nihilism, and there's no such thing as nihilists. There are only schizophrenic people who think there's such a thing. That's it.
Solipsism, I think, falls right into that same exact definition. And anyone who claims like, the whole non-duality, it's a very like new agey, everything is all just one, and then, there's no right or wrong. It's all just a lesson, right? It's all just one big thing. It's swimming together. And then like, if I say, no, good and evil exist, and they're like, that's a very dualistic, again, the fact that they're stating that that like unity is better than duality is a polarizing statement, and they're doing, they're splitting it into two. It's like, you can't escape this. Just try to just stop trying. It's insane.
Doesn't
right.
It really is. Well,
it is insane. It's like when people use their words and their thinking to say I don't exist, and I'm like, that's cute.
Right. Who said that? There's a ghost in here.
Like, who just said that? Could you please tell me who just spoke? Are you a hallucination? And then they're like, well, I'm just a hologram. Well, that's cool.
Oh.
While you're a hologram, you still have to get up tomorrow and do shit. So let's talk about the world we live in.
Right.
While we're holograms, okay?
And that's the other thing that doesn't fly with the whole, any kind of concept of morality. If you really think that this is all just some kind of video game computer program that we're in, then it really shouldn't matter if there's pedophiles and murders and the government or whatever. There's anarchists that think that morality is subjective. It's like, what do you stand? What's your foundation upon your entire philosophy of being an anarchist?
Yeah.
I honestly think that a lot of anarchists, do believe morality is objective. They don't know what words mean. In other words, a lot of people are using the phrase subjective morality to mean ethical preferences, which do exist. And they confuse the two because there is a base subjective morality that gives us a whole lot of freedom to fuck up. Like, we have a whole lot of freedom to misinterpret things and to come up with very different cultural ways of living and having ethical preferences within that framework. That's why I said there's this massive gray area. Most the universe is a gray area. And people want it all to be black and white, or to say it's all gray. They want to pick one, which is funny. Just try to say, actually, everything's gray is a black and white state of mind. It's not being open to the actual gray, which is there are actual black and white. This is absolutely, you cannot refute this. And this over here, it's up for debate. It's not necessarily, it can.
It's like Brian has this concept that he talks about, the complicated simplicity. So, there's the simplicity, and you can kind of really cover the big stuff with these very simple, don't rape, don't murder, don't steal. Those are very simple, a child can understand. But then there's this infinite world of nuance, where you could start kind of peeling back the layers and going into all the different, peripherals.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah, and there's, like, for me, again, there's so many things that it's fun to talk about, and in public I usually don't, because it's like it usually leads on a tangent that I don't think is important enough to focus on. So for a lot of, like, people who call themselves anarchists who are sort of like materialists or think it's all like there's no such thing as morality, blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, do you advocate aggression against others? No. Okay, well then I don't really care why you think that. But there is a reason that it matters, because if somebody really doesn't believe in right and wrong, it's just that today they think that a stateless society serves their interests. That's scary, because if tomorrow they think that an authoritarian ruling class serves their interests, they're going to be a fascist. And we saw some of that. And
that's pragmatism.
Yeah, we see that in the alt-right garbage where, okay, you didn't really believe any of it. It's just you thought it sounded nice, and at the time you thought it would serve you if the world was like that, and now you want a big authoritarian bully to serve you.
There's anarchists, and then there's voluntarists. An anarchist is, well, I don't want a ruler. I don't want to be ruled. That's fine. But a voluntarist is going the extra mile a little bit, because I really want all interactions to be based on consent, which includes the other person. You can say, I don't want to be ruled. And so for me, I'm an anarchist, leave me alone. But actually, I'm going to go around and violate everybody else, whatever. And there's people who totally have revealed that was their actual mindset all along. They were identifying as an anarchist because they're just like, I want to do whatever I want. But what they didn't mean to include was up to and including violating other people when it suits me too.
See, this is why it's so important that anarchists be anarchists for moral reasons. If they're just anarchists right now because on a practical basis they think it'll serve them better, that's no guarantee that tomorrow they won't be aggressive stealing psychos or politicians or rulers or something, because it's just, well, whatever works for me. And luckily, I think most people get there by way of, one way or another, get there by way of the moral thing of it's not okay to violate consent. It's not okay to commit aggression.
Right.
But the ones who just say, well, this works out better right now. If tomorrow they're like, oh, my culture and my race, and now we need a big ruling class. It's like, okay, you weren't ever actually opposed to the concept of a ruling class.
Right.
You just didn't want one ruling you. But now if you think a ruling class will serve you at the expense of somebody else, you're all for it, because you didn't ever actually advocate in principle anarchism. You just advocated whatever you thought would serve your interests, which is a very different thing than saying, it's like the test is, do you advocate freedom for other people to do things that you think are sort of stupid and you don't particularly like it and it doesn't really help your interest? That's what it means to advocate freedom, not I advocate your freedom to do whatever you want as long as it works for me and helps me out. Like that's
it's like the word anarchy. You know, are you saying no rulers for you, or like no rulers for anyone? Like no rulers.
Yeah, and that's why I think voluntarism, to me, that goes the extra step a little bit, because voluntarism seems to include all interactions. That doesn't just mean it includes both sides. It really does make you look at both sides, and then in addition
society.
To that, and it doesn't have the stigma that anarchy does to begin with. So I like using it more and more now. I'll use the word anarchist for the people that know what I mean, but voluntarism is better, because a lot of people still think, well, if you're an anarchist, you must want to do something violent or something.
Right. Or the other side of things, because, there's the great debate between ANCOMs and ANCAPs. And I think, if we're looking at this sort of dichotomy between anarchy and voluntarism, is anarchy, they tend to be way, way more individualistic. And they're, like they almost act like any sort of cooperative effort starts, they're like, that's communism, or that's the state, or whatever. They're like anti even like coming together and doing things in groups. It's like, just in every man for themselves kind of thing. I'm not making like a blanket statement, but I've definitely seen these people, out and about on the interwebs that really have that mindset.
Yeah, there's some of them, and there's like, to me, it matters. Like when somebody says they're an anarcho-communist, my first question is, what if other people, including me, aren't going to do that? We're going to do the trade and private property thing. Are you going to violently interfere? If they say no, I'll say, okay, that's cool. I don't think your way will usually work out very well, but it's not because I'm going to interfere with it.
Right.
Like,
you're welcome.
Can't you say communityist or something? Like, do you have to use such a dirty word? Like communityist would be better than communist. Like, it's a little more.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that I think most people who call themselves that aren't clear on what their own words mean, even, because it's like, well, I'm just about sharing and helping each other out. It's like, it's not what it means.
Oh, that sounds good. I'm that. I'll be that.
Right.
Right. Well, and it's funny because they say, like, it's the whole, like, well, real communism hasn't been tried. And it's like, if every time that word has ever been meant anything, it's meant violent oppression by a government, then the word needs to go. But the anarchy never meant violence or chaos, ever. It never meant that. It was distorted into that through propaganda. It never actually meant that. And so it's sort of like saying, it's to say you're an ANCOM and yet you're really just, I want the world to kind of be a big commune where it's all voluntary. That's sort of like saying, I'm an anarchist who is for government, but only the voluntary kind with no coercion. Well, then you're not. Like, so a lot of ANCOMs I talk to, either they don't really understand, like, they either don't really understand what communism actually is or was. They have this idealized version of what it should be, or they're just not really, they're not really communists. They're really actually anarchists, but something about trade and business scares them. So because they're sort of uncomfortable with that, because they see the crony capitalism with government interfering in business and connecting and yoking itself with business, that makes them nervous, and they go, well, not that, and their emotions just go, I'm going to choose this label. Communism, they don't really mean the government kind. A bunch of them do have this, I just want everybody to be free and happy and like be able to barter and stuff.
Well, I think there's sort of this fuzzy thing too, that when people say, I'm an anarcho, this, that, or the other thing, often it means I don't believe in a ruling class, and I kind of hope everybody chooses this. And it's sort of like, okay, but putting them into one term is really weird. Like it's not really related. It's what you want people to choose personally, and there could be, you could put 8,000 suffixes on the end of the word. Like, I think people should have mostly monogamous relationships, and I think people should rest on Sunday, and I think people, like, who cares? Like that's unrelated to, there shouldn't be a ruling class.
Because those are their rights, not the wrongs. We're just trying to, the word that gets rid of the wrong. The rights, that's the point, is we're getting the other thing out of the way so that you can do whatever the hell you want as long as it's not harming anyone else.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And what you would suggest other people do, or what you think would work best, is just your suggestions. It's not even like it doesn't belong in the same concept as there shouldn't be a ruling class. It's sort of, I think things would work better if people did this or that. Because if you're not forcing it on people, that's just sort of listing a bunch of random arbitrary preferences on the end of an actual concept.
Even anarcho-capitalism, like both terms bother me or sort of annoy me and are useless, because it's like anarcho-communism is self-refuting and anarcho-capitalism is extraneous and redundant. Like, you don't have to say that neither of those things make sense. You either think there should be a ruling class and people should get to violate one another, or you don't. And it's very simple. And beyond that, everything else is your preference.
I'm an anarcho-voluntarist.
Super redundant.
Yeah, anarcho. Yeah, well, it's funny because I often just, now when I make posts and stuff, and I have my network on social media being like the size it is now, I often just am like, all right, fine, anarchist / voluntarist / libertarian, whatever. Like, I try to just try to get people to understand that, like, if your philosophy is lining up, they should all mean the same thing.
Right.
If the morality is there, it should mean the same thing. Like, a true libertarian shouldn't be a part of the Libertarian Party. That's not libertarian. A true libertarian would be synonymous with being an anarchist, except that word got muddied by there being a libertarian party.
Yeah. Well, to throw in sort of a weird twist, I think a lot of people, when they're the kind of person who likes to philosophize and think about stuff and have discussions like this, which is really cool, and they want to understand every facet of everything and think about everything, which is awesome, and I think it would be nice if more people wanted to understand more stuff, but they find little things to bicker about, and sometimes the bickering is very good and actually useful, but I think some people get discouraged by seeing the bickering, like, oh, why are we fighting about this? Is like, we might as well discuss it and talk about it, because none of that touches the thing of, like, and don't, commit aggression and don't have a ruling class. Like, and then we talk about the 8 million things that come after that, but none of them like back up, well, we can't agree on what this is, so now let's have a ruling class again. So it's not like the rest of the world isn't going to hang on to statism just because two anarchists couldn't decide what they both think about abortion or something. Like when the belief in authority falls apart, it fell apart. And there's still stuff to talk about and bicker about and even disagree about, and maybe even have violent conflict about now and then. But the gigantic thing, when that goes away, all the rest of the stuff is useful, but in one sense it's sort of trivial compared to this giant, huge, violent monstrosity that's responsible for like most of the evil in the world.
Another way to describe the fall of statism is every single human individual returns unapologetically, ruthlessly to obeying their own conscience.
Yeah.
That's it. That is all that needs to happen. That is the fall of statism. That's how it dies. Yeah. That's it. There isn't a one size fits all, how does society do blah 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 blah. And the funny thing is that people who are starting to think like anarchists and become anarchists who still like to do the thought experiments, they'll sometimes get hung up too much on the thought experiments like they matter. Like, well, so let's talk about theories. What if A person and B person are fighting over this property, and A person has his boundary lines here, and B person has this, and it's like the whole presumption of asking the what if scenario between A and B person.
You're outsourcing your conscience.
Is that well? It's actually the assumption that you get to decide which is right and wrong for A and B in that scenario. In other words, to do a what if scenario where you're talking about two people who don't exist, you are in God mode. You are outside the scenario playing God. You're playing an omniscient perspective you don't actually have and wouldn't. You aren't A and you aren't B. You're the person talking about A and B. But that doesn't exist. I'm not God. So my answer to people is, well, what would A and B do in a free society? Whatever A and B figure out amongst themselves is the answer.
But who will be the final decider?
What's the objectively right thing for A and B? It doesn't matter, because I don't get to jump in and go, what you guys worked out wasn't really ideal. Let me interfere and make it objectively right for B, because B didn't get what B deserved and A didn't, give B what B deserved. So let me jump in and assert what I think is moral. And people having a savior complex and asserting themselves into other people's lives is how we get statism to begin with.
But it's also the master plan paradigm. It's the idea of, like, when they say, well, what will be done about this? It's like, by whom? What are you talking about? There isn't like some magical entity, the emperor of anarchy, that will impose, like, what will be done? It's whatever all the individuals decide to do on their own and whatever happens. But
I think it's just their fear.
Yeah.
They're like, well, we need to have all these little micro scenarios figured out. And then if you can give me a good answer for all these millions of little things, then maybe I'll consider it.
Yeah, then I'll consider it. Yeah, because they want the promises and they want the master plan and they want the final decider, which is the thing I've written about before, which is it's just a mental and emotional crutch. I want somebody to magically, some all-powerful thing to magically make the right decisions and enforce it on everybody. It's like, well, that would be nice, and it's totally impossible. And every time anybody ever tries to make one of them, it turns into a big violent tyrant.
So it's funny that there's still anarchists or freedom thinkers who really seem like they want to figure out what will be done about, because asking the question is the statism that hasn't died in them. Yeah. Asking the question is the status that was indoctrinated to think there's got to be a master plan, or I need to know ahead of time what's going to happen in my life before I leave my front door. And what I ask people when they start asking those questions is, well, what about this and what about this, and how can you explain to me how this will be done? I say, do you try to figure out what the future is all before you step out your front door? Do you try to plan the next 10 years of your life and make sure your boss and everyone around you can guarantee they'll always be nice to you, always be able to give you work, and that nobody's ever going to cause problems in your life? Do you go out and try to make sure okay, I need to go through and make sure my grandma's never going to argue with me. I need to go through and make sure that everything's going to I need to make sure that before I walk out my front door, I call everyone I know and make sure there's nothing bad going on outside, and that my car, and have
all the other drivers will be safe.
I need to figure out how to contact all the folks on the road to make sure that I know for sure they're not going to run into me. I should probably call the local cops to make sure no one's outside my house before I leave it. And it's nobody operates that way. No one operates that way.
I need to be certain about my certainty before I'm certainly certain.
Right. And the thing is the insanity is in asking those questions, and they don't see that yet until the statism is all the way left them. And that's the thing is, becoming an anarchist, nobody told me, was a gradual thing. The morality clicked in a second. It was boom. When I really got it, that was a second. The programming for years has taken years to come out in layers of my brain just unraveling and going, whoa.
You have to take that new truth and rewire that into the circuitry of, okay, well, how does this fit into this bullshit thing that I used to believe in,
Yeah, because it's a whole change of the paradigm. Because when people say, well, how will this be handled under anarchy? And I say, first of all, why do you think I would know?
Under anarchy.
Under anarchy, that's a thing.
There's a status
subjugation.
under it.
right,
Right.
why do you think I would know? Why do you think it would be up to me? I'm not going to be in charge. And why do you think anybody would know? You're you. Your
Right.
answer
Figure
is,
it out.
yeah,
Be an
your
adult.
answer is just as much an answer as mine would be of like, what should be done about this? Like, well, I'm not your babysitter. I'm not your dad. Why are you asking me? Figure it out.
So the question is, what would you do?
Right.
What would you do?
But
What
unfortunately,
would you do if you were asked to give up your dreams for freedom?
unfortunately, that's a mindset most people have almost no practice being in. And that's why one of the things, like I've done before, is the island analogy and the mirror, and that does it too, is when you don't have an authority to run to and it's in front of you, and it's like, well, what would you do about that? Suddenly, when people start to think about that for the first time, A, it's uncomfortable, and B, their answers are always better than the government answers.
Yep.
They just have to like learn to be a grown up instead of asking somebody else and asking the teacher, well, what happens if this happens? I don't know. What are you going to do about it? What is up to me? And so it's a paradigm shift, and it takes a while to get people to realize, why would I ask somebody else what would happen without a ruling class? Like, why would they know more than me?
It's an appeal to authority. It's like two siblings bickering, and then they go and tell the parents and say, like, he won't give me my toy back, and the parent has to come in and go, okay, here's how justice will be served.
Right.
And this, you know.
Yeah.
I think it all really
made the scene.
I think it all really goes back to that foundational programming of having the responsibility, our ability to respond, put outside of ourselves.
Yeah.
You know, whether that's put into a priest class, a ruling class, whatever it may be. People are so programmed and used to looking for the answer outside of themselves. They're afraid or never even consider that they could ask themselves that question.
Yeah.
You know, that they could find that answer within themselves. So, that's really a fundamental thing that it is, and the work that we need to do is to get back to recognizing our individual sovereignty, being able to tap into that direct contact with source, as you were mentioning earlier, you know, that you have that direct access. And then this brings up, you know, for me here is that really the importance of coming to anarchy, not only, you know, through the logical, the left brain perspective, but being able to come at it through a heart-based understanding, you know, because, you know, as you were talking about earlier, you know, yeah, it's nice to not want to have rulers over you, but you also have to have that same respect that you have for yourself and extend that to other beings, you know, so it, you know, that tying in with the law of correspondence, you know, so we want to have that reflected inside, but also outside.
Yeah. And that, like what you were saying before about the conscience being supreme, is have everyone follow their conscience. That's sort of the punchline, both of Candles in the Dark and of The Mirror, is to put someone in a position where it's like, okay, your conscience says this is the right thing, and authority says that's the right thing. What do you do? And it's just to bring people up to the point where they have to decide, well, I know what the right thing is. Like, my conscience is telling me this is what I should do. And unfortunately, so many things in the culture are trying to train people to ignore their conscience in favor of obedience. And just the process of getting people to do that. So most of the lines of questioning in Candles in the Dark, one way or another, end with, well, if authority tells you to do something that your conscience tells you is wrong, are you obligated to obey? And people get all uncomfortable, but usually they say, well, no, at the end of the day, I have to do what I think is right. Like, that's it. That's the entire thing.
Right. There's you just made the state like disintegrate into dust in that one acknowledgement by doing that.
Absolutely. Because the moment you say that your conscience outranks authority, by definition, it isn't authority anymore. Because you just said you don't have an obligation to obey it. It just goes poof. Because it was all in your imagination to begin with. And so the entire goal is to get people to reclaim their conscience and say, yeah, I have to figure out right and wrong, and I have to do what I think is right. Like, and how tough is that? But that's all it takes to demolish statism.
It's weird because, like, statism has its tendrils in everything, you know, and that's why we see that, you know, yeah, there's a free-ish market going on in, you know, places all over the U.S., and it's still alive and well in some places, but we also have the slave market, the regulated market, the crony capitalist market. And I look at how my you know, me getting the influence of being taught to constantly seek morality secondhand and just repeat somebody else's morality, even that is part of the reason that I see it as so much a fundamental part of just choices I made throughout my early adulthood that I didn't even realize were connected to that programming. Like, for example, choosing a corporate job, right? It's not evil to do that, but here's an example of like a job area where so many people, almost universally corporate jobs, are known for being hated. Like, people do not like and very commonly resent being chained to a desk in an office 9 to 5, 40 hours a week, especially for a company or business where they constantly run into having to do things that their conscience is not okay with, even if it's little things. It might be just how they treat the customer, how they go about handling the accounting, how they deal with management, and all of that stuff. The reason people even tolerate it and don't just have this, you know, ruthless willingness to quit any job, you know, that requires them to violate their morality is because they already were taught to compromise their morality from the time they were young and to not listen to their conscience. They were taught whatever everyone else says is okay, what everyone else tells you to do, suck it up and do it. And if a bunch of people doing it are doing it, it's probably fine. But I remember working for, you know, companies like the University of Phoenix and American Express. And these corporations do evil crap. They actually do absolutely crooked stuff all the time. And I would justify it in my own head as what? I'm doing my job. And so you have a whole you have a whole society that not just government, but regular people trying to make ends meet are constantly facing things in their conscience where they feel like they have to be violating it just to make ends meet. And right. Just getting rid of authority in my head made me a whole new level of ruthlessly devoted to morality. And I mean, willing to get my bank account to zero, not knowing where my money was coming from next, but still not going to get a corporate job, even though that was the easiest thing to go get because that was where most of my experience was. And I was like, I won't go get one again. I won't.
Well, a big part of that is people want to believe in authority because they want to escape responsibility. And as long as you can use the illusion to think, well, if I'm just obeying orders and doing as I'm told and, you know, enforcing the law or doing my job or whatever it is, I'm not to blame. Like, it wasn't my decision. I was told to do this and then I did this. As long as you believe in that, you'll do evil stuff like the Milgram.
Well, you're actually compounding your moral culpability because not only are you still doing the evil action, but you're also trying to, you know, abdicate your own personal responsibility for it, and actually, you know, you're being an order follower, but you're being in a machine, that's just following a program.
Yeah, they're pretending that they can do stuff and not be responsible for their own actions, which is never true, but they try really, really hard to believe that it is.
Right.
And when there isn't that, when you can't just say, I was just following orders, when you're like, well, of course, I did it, I'm responsible for it, the whole world gets so much better because suddenly the vast majority of evil stops happening because the vast majority of evil isn't done by individually malicious people. It's done by law-abiding taxpayers just doing as they were told. Yep. And when they say, this is evil, I'm not doing it, no matter what you say, the huge regimes of sociopaths fall apart because they're mostly manned by just sort of cowardly order obeyers.
And the reason for that is because it all comes back to choice, which, you know, we mentioned the Matrix earlier. And in my humble opinion, I think that's the entire message of the whole damn trilogy is there's no escaping choice. You even trying to escape a choice is a choice that you're making. So even when we vote for these politicians and, well, you know, they said they were going to do this and they didn't, and, you know, we trusted you. Yeah, you trusted them. You made the choice to put your sovereignty in their hands, and guess what? They did the same thing they always do and fucked you over. You're the only one to blame for that, not them.
Yep, the only thing you can't escape is choice itself.
Like Rush said it best.
If you choose not to decide,
you still have made a choice.
I love that line. So you still
I will choose free will.
Yep, and I love that. It's funny because there doesn't need to be anything between you and finding the truth. There doesn't need to be anyone or anything between you and finding the truth. When he said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," he didn't mean my ego, the physical flesh and blood body that appeared here. He meant the person, like you are, like through you, like God comes through you and God comes through me. Like the only way to the truth and the life of the universe and figuring out what it is go inward and find your conscience. That's
right.
where
Me being the individual, not Jesus himself.
The individual. Yes.
And
that has to be allegorical, because
right.
That's the only way it works.
I think this is the perfect discussion for me to throw in the punchline that I think the ultimate sin and the ultimate blasphemy, the ultimate insult to whatever created me and humanity and the rest of the universe is if I try to defer my free will and conscience to somebody or something else.
Yep.
And people do it by way of churches, and they do it by way of governments, and they do it by way of all sorts of things. That is the sin. If there is the epitome of the devil, it literally is the belief in authority, because it literally is saying, I'm going to ignore that which makes me human, my conscience, my free will. I'm going to override that and make myself into a robot where all I do is blindly obey what that thing over there tells me to do. That is worse than suicide. If you're going to do that, you might as well kill yourself, because if you do the thing of, I'm just going to obey orders, not only did you killed your brain and your mind and your soul, but you left your body hanging around to be a pawn for the worst people in the world. And that is why, as much as people think obedience is a virtue, it really is the ultimate sin. To ignore your own conscience is the ultimate anti-human evil choice.
Right.
Yeah. Anti-human, anti-truth, and anti-God. If God is truly love and truth at the center of the universe, then it's anti all of that.
Whatever made us
gave us free will.
It's anti that.
Yeah, it comes back to the master and slave dynamic. So, by being an order follower, even though you're lording over others in your own little mini-me way, you're still a slave to the system and a slave to, the rules that you're following. Or you try to come out on top, like by being an order giver, and you're still betraying your humanity, just in a kind of a different way. It's that imbalance, that because you're not coming from holistic consciousness, basically.
Yeah.
Well, I think this is maybe a good time to kind of wrap things up. It's definitely been a very interesting conversation about a lot of different things. Touched on a lot of different aspects and things. So you guys, if you'd like to have the floor and let the listeners know, what are y'all up to? How can they find you? What projects are you working on? What do you want to promote? This is your space.
We are doing another Candles in the Dark in Las Vegas in a couple months.
In July, late July.
And there were bits and pieces in this discussion that gave people hints. If anybody's out there, an anarchist and a voluntarist, and been really frustrated at trying to talk to other people and trying to get them to hear you, if you think you've tried everything, you probably haven't. And there's so much. It's ironic because the mistake most people made in trying to communicate is they're trying to control the thoughts of the other person, and you don't get to do that. And you should not and do not have the ability to do that.
Yeah.
But there's already a voluntarist in that person, and there are ways to get through so you can talk to him and bring him out from underneath the authoritarian BS he was taught. So we'll be doing
very well said. So, but I can definitely, personally, testimonial for your program, because I have, been in attendance myself, and it is amazing. And it's funny because I was actually just telling a friend, because I've been, having a lot of online conversations lately, and it crossed my mind, and I read back up through the comment thread that I was going back and forth with a person, and I realized I was doing it like instinctively, and how much more effective it is. So I mean, if it really, and the funny thing is, most of the people, they, you know, oftentimes they still won't get it, but I get so much from those interactions by simply exploring the psychology of the programming that we are up against. If we truly say we care about freedom and you know, enacting that change, you know, it's just as important for us to come to those deeper understandings and better ways to word things, even if the other person that you're talking to didn't seem, you know, fazed by it necessarily. But yeah,
and even
I absolutely recommend that.
Even if they don't seem phased, you never can tell, because often they'll sound confident and solid in their position, but little things that they were hesitant to answer will rattle around inside their head and make a difference, even if while you were talking to them, it seems like, they're stubborn, they weren't paying attention. If you do it right, you'll still be planting seeds, and you never can tell what they're going to grow.
Sure. That little anarchist inside them heard it, even if their brain was like, no, and then rejected it.
And so we're going to do that. But now Anarchadelphia is happening in September, and so people can start planning for that. It's going to be in Philadelphia, obviously, and we're going to do Candles in the Dark there. So
nice. And I will be at that event as well.
Cool.
Yeah. Oh, and where the audience can find us, we're both on Facebook. If you want to look at his Patreon project, that's The Mirror, and you can like contribute to that there. He's made lots of posts about his work in The Mirror and what he's working on, and thrown out ways for people to like donate to our cause or what we're doing. So like I've put out my PayPal out there, and we have Bitcoin addresses and Facebook posts that are out there.
And we'll drop all those links, whatever you guys want, we'll link down below in the description for everyone. So, and then finally, of course, we need a status or progress update on The Mirror. What's going on with that?
Well, my update is that I now do regular updates. I try to do them every week, but I'm usually a few days late.
Cool.
For the Patreon donors. It's still many months away, but these days I have much more time to work on it because of one person in particular, who I will not mention. It's the two huge sides of it are writing the script, this big 3-dimensional script that it has to go in all directions depending on how anybody answers the question, and then computer animation of all of it. And I've been doing a bunch on both, but I try to post weekly updates, because before I was like, no, you just have to wait until you see the whole thing. And I was like, people have no idea what's even going on.
Yeah, so you got to keep people, you know, keep giving them, dangling a little carrot a little bit, you know.
So I give little weekly updates.
To put something into, I think it's important to explain something here that for a lot of people they don't fully grasp, because people just, unfortunately, people still fall into entitlement mentality. So you might be creating something for free, and they will still, without ever donating a dime, bug you relentlessly about when it's going to be finished. And one thing that people don't seem to get is The Mirror is the equivalent of something that would take, in order to do it very fast, it would normally take a team of 200 people and millions of dollars. Like it's the equivalent of working on a full-length movie, but even more complex because it's an interactive computer program world, like a mini video game, and it has a massive script, and he's doing every part of it himself because he's the creative mind that understands very well how every part of it needs to be done, and he knows exactly how it needs to be done, and he can't outsource any of it, but he also has very limited resources, and we aren't and haven't been financially free yet. So the fact that most of the time we have to work on other things and he can't work on that because he's not going to get paid for it, he doesn't get paid to work on it, has been the reason that it hasn't even been able to be really started for like you thought of the idea, or you were coming up with the idea in 2014, and you finally conceptualized the idea in 2014, and it's been 5 years. And you probably actually were able to start working on it like 2.5 years ago, and then not even consistently, because
bits and pieces,
and it was still bits and pieces, and then a bunch of it, because it's such a massive project, started out as the conceptualization. So think of like the movies that Hollywood does, and look at the credits for those. That's what the credits would be on this. If somebody was like, I'm going to try and do The Mirror and release it in a year, you would need a few $1 million, and you would need a team, and then you would need the guy to put everything in his brain into everyone in the team fast enough so that they could do it right, and he's doing it all himself. So we're getting to a place now where we're financially better off, and he's been able to charge ahead way more, and now we're actually picking up speed. So it doesn't look like, oh, this will be done in 30 years. It looks like it could actually be done, you know, in the next
a couple of years.
And so, but it's massive. So people have this weird expectation that a video game interactive world that's massive should just pop up overnight.
Well, and if somebody doesn't know how something's made, it's sort of understandable that they just
they don't know what Blender is and how you.
It's the same thing with movies. If they see a movie and have no idea what goes into it, it's like, why did that take you a year and a half to make? In this case, it's like a huge movie that could have like 1,000 different outcomes, and we had to produce all of the outcomes, like all the ways it could go.
It's something that most people never would attack on their own. Most people would never.
Right.
So
it'll be a while, but now I'm working on it a bunch more. So
it's and he's finalized the script. It's finite.
Yeah.
Nice.
Good to hear. Well, thank you both very much for joining us. We hope to have you on again sometime, I'm sure. And I think it was a really good discussion. Hopefully give people some good things to think about and consider.
It's been fun.
I appreciate
it was fun. I loved it.
Yep.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's going to conclude the episode tonight. Don't forget to click the subscribe button if you enjoyed this content. And until next week, be empowered, inspired, and encouraged.
Woo!